And we're going to continue as we look at our 16 fundamentals of truths as we've been going through this sermon series. And this one today is one that affects each and every one of us. Because we're going to be talking today about divine healing. What does God have to say about divine healing? You see, I believe God is still able to heal people today, and that He does heal people today. I know in my own family, we have experienced the healing power of God. And I know many of you have as well. And we are a church that believes in prayer. We are a church that believes in the power of God, and we are not ashamed of that. We believe He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so we are not afraid to trust Him, and we are not afraid to bring our needs to Him because He tells us to do that. Our official statement says this. Well, where is it? Is it up on? There it is. Divine healing is an integral part of the gospel. It's part of the gospel. It's part of why Jesus came. Deliverance from sickness is provided for in the atonement and is the privilege of all believers. I know several people here today can bear witness to God's supernatural healing in your life. But I also know there may be some who question whether or not God still does the miraculous today when it comes to healing. In the book of Psalms we read, "O Lord my God, I cried to Thee for help, and You did heal me. You have kept me alive. How blessed is he who considers the helpless. The Lord will deliver him in a day of trouble. The Lord will protect him and keep him alive, and he shall be called blessed upon the earth. And do not give him over to the desire of his enemies. The Lord will sustain him upon his sickbed. In his illness, You do restore him to health." Then they cried out to the Lord in their trouble, and He saved them out of their distresses. He sent His word and healed them and delivered them from their destructions. Now we know the Bible is filled with the accounts of people who have been physically healed by God. In fact, there are more than we can even talk about in one message. But the question still presents itself to us today. Do you really believe that God can heal your sickness today? Do you really believe that He can heal your sickness today? And there's a second question that goes along with that. Do you really believe what you say you believe? Do you really believe what you say you believe? That is where our faith is brought in. That is where our faith is challenged and proven. As we look to answer that question and build our faith this morning, let's first look at, why do people get sick? I'm going to read from Psalm 38. You can just listen to it if you like, or you could turn there. It says this, "My guilt overwhelms me. It is a burden too heavy to bear. My wounds fester and stink because of my foolish sins. I am bent over and racked with pain. All day long I walk around filled with grief. A raging fever burns within me. My health is broken. I am exhausted and completely crushed. My groans come from an anguished heart. My heart beats wildly. My strength fails, and I am going blind. My loved ones and friends stay away, fearing my disease. Even my own family stands at a distance." Boy, after the last few years, can we not see how that applies? "Because of your anger, my whole body is sick. and my health is broken because of my sin. The first reason that people get sick is because of sin. It was not until Adam and Eve disobeyed God that sin and sickness entered into their lives. So sickness exists not as a result of God's will, but as a result of the curse of sin. We need to understand that. The things that we experience, the trials we experience in life, sometimes the many questions we have of why me, is directly linked back to the sin issue. John chapter 5, verse 2. Thankfully, as we're going to look at these, I want to point out Jesus has authority over all of them. That we keep that in mind. But in John chapter 5, beginning in verse 2, we have this story. Now in Jerusalem by the sheep gate, there is a pool which in Hebrew is called Bethesda, having 5 porticos. In these porticos lay a multitude of those who were sick, blind, limping, or paralyzed. So use your imagination and picture this setting. There's a pool, and there are these 5 porticos that surround it. And all of the sick of the community would come and lay around this pool. Now there was a man there who had been ill for 38 years. Jesus, upon seeing this man lying there and knowing that he had already been in that condition for a long time, said to him, "Do you want to get well?" I always find that question interesting. Here is a man, and we read Jesus knew he's been sick for 38 years. Jesus knew all about him. There are sick people laying all around him. All types of diseases and illnesses and infirmities. And Jesus approaches this one man. And he asks him the question, "Do you want to get well?" Like, why do we even have to ask that? Why did Jesus ask this man that question? Why does he ask us the question? Because I have found that there are times where people get so accustomed to being in their condition that they really don't want to change from it. And so Jesus asked this man, "Do you want to get well or not? Like, do you want your life to change? Or have you become satisfied with your condition? Have you just settled into it that this is the way I have been, this is the way I will always be?" Whether it be a physical illness, whether it be an emotional trauma that has happened to you, there are times where we experience things, and I find that some people get comfortable in their infirmity. And so Jesus asks, "Do you want to get well?" I think there are times where he asks of us, "Do you want your life to change? Do you really want it to change? Do you really want me to come and make a difference in your life? Or are you quite happy in the condition you're in?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me." The scenario of this story is that an angel would come and stir the water, and the first one into the water would be healed. And so this man responds to Jesus' question with an excuse. "I'd like to get healed, but I can't. In my condition, everybody gets there before me. I don't have anyone here to help me. So, this is all my life is going to be." Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your pallet and walk." Now, I often, again, I try to put myself into these accounts of Scripture to understand the emotion or understand the circumstance as best I can. What must it have been like for this man for 38 years who could not walk? And all of a sudden, this guy named Jesus shows up and asks him, hey, do you want to get well? Well, I'd like to, but I can't. I just don't have anyone to help me. Oh, pick up your pallet and walk. Hello, do you not see I'm having a problem here? Do you not see I can't walk? That's why I'm laying here. Do you not see my condition? Oh, yes, Jesus saw. Jesus saw it before he ever talked to the man. Jesus saw it before he ever asked him, do you want to get well? He already knew what that man was facing. Get up, pick up your pallet and walk. And immediately, the man became well and picked up his pallet and began to walk. Now, it was a Sabbath on that day. And so the Jews were saying to the man who was cured, it is a Sabbath, and it is not permissible for you to carry your pallet. So the little thing he was laying on, the little bed, because it was the Sabbath, if you carried something of weight, it was considered work. And so they say to this guy, why are you carrying your bed around? That's work. That's not permissible on the Sabbath. And he answered them, he who made me well was the one who said to me, pick up your pallet and walk. And they said, who is the man who said to you, pick it up and walk? But the man who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had slipped away while there was a crowd in that place. This man didn't even know who Jesus was. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple, which we should note, the man got up and walked, and he went to the temple. He went to worship God. He had been healed from 38 years of not being able to walk, and his first response was, I got to go thank God. I don't know who the guy was that healed me, but I'm going to thank God that I'm healed. Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, behold, you've become well. Do not sin anymore. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you. Do not sin anymore. We know many times when Jesus healed, he also forgave sin. And we need to understand this aspect of Jesus' ministry. That's why we say it's part of the atonement. That Jesus can indeed heal, but he can also forgive sin. The sin that is the initiator and the cause of the curse that is upon humankind. Jesus has authority over that. The man went away and informed the Jews that it was Jesus who made him well. Hey, that question you asked me earlier, who was the guy who healed me? Jesus did. Now I know who it is. Now I know his name, and now I'm telling you who he was. Now I don't want to get off track too much by looking at the Jews who were upset because Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath. For our purpose today, I want to look at what Jesus said to the man that he healed. Behold, you become well. Do not sin anymore, so that nothing worse happens to you. These words of Jesus certainly imply that sin was the cause of the man's illness, and that if he didn't stop sinning, something worse could come upon his life. What does that mean? Does that mean that if he committed a sin after he was healed, that his healing would be taken away? No, that's not what Jesus said. He said something worse would happen to you. What could be worse? What is a worse result of sin? Well, being separated from God for eternity. Certainly it's not an easy thing to live this life and not be able to walk for 38 years. difficult, hard. But Jesus forgave his sin. He says, go forth from here and don't sin anymore. Because if you live a life of sin, there is a worse thing that will befall you, even than your illness. But let's face it, there are people who are sick because of sinful decisions they've made in their lives. In the first church I pastored, there was a dear lady, older lady who came and got saved. And she was a sweet lady. Came and sat, I don't know, about second row from the back every week. And she attended our church for a while, and then one Sunday she came in and she said, Pastor, I need to talk to you. And I said, okay. And she says, I want you to know that I have emphysema. And I may not have long to live. It's really attacking my lungs. And I said, I am so sorry to hear that. And she said, but you know what, Pastor? I'm not mad at God about this. It's not God's fault that I have emphysema. I'm the one that chose to smoke for 20 years. It's just the natural course of my sinful choices. And I said, to hear that from a newer Christian showed great maturity in understanding her relationship with God. She wasn't blaming God for her circumstance. She knew it was her own doing. And so we need to realize that there are times where we go through trials because of our own doing. We need to just be aware of that. Now, certainly that doesn't mean that everybody who sins is going to contract some disease. We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. But sickness can be a natural consequence of sinful living. It can also be a part of believers' lives. We talked about this quite a few weeks ago, but I just want to bring it up because it applies to our situation. The Apostle Paul gives this somber warning to those within the body of believers who do not rightly recognize and honor the fellowship and unity of Christ. In 1 Corinthians 11:28, Paul writes, but a person must examine himself, and in so doing, he is to eat of the bread and drink of the cup. For the one who eats and drinks judgment to himself if he does not properly recognize the body. Paul says that there were some in that church that were sick and some who had died because they had received communion. They had eaten the bread and they had drank the cup and not rightly recognized what Christ commands them to do within the fellowship of believers. That they were not rightly honoring their relationship with God nor their relationship with their brothers and sisters. That they were in some way either living in selfishness, or they were backbiting, or they were involved in some other type of dissension in the church. And the result of that was they would come and they would eat the bread and drink the cup and say, oh, I'm a lover of Jesus. And it says that God would bring judgment on them that resulted in their sickness or their weakness or their death. That is why every time we come to the Lord's table, I try and remind us we need to think rightly about what we're doing. It's not just a religious ritual of eating a piece of bread and drinking some juice. It is an understanding of what it represents to us. And it represents our fellowship with our Creator through Jesus Christ, His Son. And it represents our fellowship with one another who are believers in Him along with us. However, even in these circumstances, does not mean God isn't able or willing to heal. We read how Jesus would not only heal people who were sick, but would also forgive them of their sins. A second reason people get sick is because of demonic influence. We must not leave out this aspect. We find it in Luke chapter 13, verse 10. Of course, there are many examples. I'm only, again, going through one at a time, or one instance of it. Luke 13, verse 10. Now Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and there was a woman who for 18 years had had a sickness caused by a spirit. She was bent over double and could not straighten up at all. When Jesus saw her, he called her over and said to her, "Woman, you are freed from your sickness." And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she stood up straight again and began glorifying God. There can be sickness that comes from demonic influence. The Bible clearly teaches that some of them are a direct result. On more than one occasion, we see how demonic possession or oppression was directly responsible for illness. Another example in the book of Matthew, chapter 9, says this: "As they were going out, behold, a demon-possessed man was unable to speak and was brought to Jesus. And after the demon was cast out, the man who was previously unable to speak talked. And the crowds were amazed and were saying, 'Nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel.' And Jesus was going through all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every type of disease and sickness." So again, we can see sickness can be linked directly to the work of Satan and his demons. Again, that does not mean every sickness is, but it can be one of the reasons. But again, even in this, Jesus is more than able to heal. Now, I also want us to point out, or I want to point out to you, that we do not associate every ailment to some sort of spirit of a demon. To do so is to misrepresent the very teachings of Jesus. But some people can be affected by that. This brings us to the third reason people get sick in John chapter 9. As Jesus passed by, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. So this man from birth has been blind. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he would be born blind?" Understand the question that came in the mind of the disciples. They attributed every illness as a result of sin. And so this man is blind, and they say to Jesus, "Jesus, look at this man, he's blind. He's been blind from birth. Was it his fault or was it his parents' fault?" Jesus answered, "It was neither. It was not that this man sinned, nor his parents, but it was so that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must carry out the works of him who sent me as long as it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. And while I am in the world, I am the light of the world." And when he had said this, he spit on the ground and made mud from the saliva and applied the mud to his eyes and said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which translated means sent. And so he left and washed and came back seeing. If we are honest, there have probably been times where we have thought about a person that has become seriously ill or has gone through some trial, and we have had the same thought. What did they do, God, that this has happened to them? Surely they must have done something wrong for them to end up in this condition. They must have done something to deserve this. Otherwise, why would God allow it? And again, we have to be very careful. That's the way the disciples thought in this scenario. And Jesus was very clear. You're wrong. It's neither one of those things. In fact, it is that God is going to be glorified. God is going to be exalted through this man's illness. Those are the times where we may pray for someone who is sick. We may ask, why has this happened? And there are times we must allow that God has allowed it for a reason. God will always bring glory to Himself when one of His children goes through suffering. He will never allow you to go through suffering just to see you suffer. It will result in His glory, and it will also result for your best in some way. You may not see it right now, but He's at work in you. He's accomplishing His will in you. There are times when God is glorified as a direct result of someone's illness. It may be that He performs a miraculous healing and is glorified. Every example we've seen of healing so far, the result of that was that the people glorified God, or the people worshiped God. When God heals, that should be our response. Oh God, thank you. Oh God, you are worthy of glory. So God may be glorified as He does a miraculous healing. But sometimes He is glorified as He sustains that person in His grace. Sometimes He is glorified by saying, my grace is sufficient for you. I know you want this to change, but my grace is more than sufficient for you. Of course, that reminds us of what happened to Paul. Paul, who had seen the miraculous, done the miraculous, seen people healed, seen people raised from the dead, now comes to the Lord on his own behalf. Oh Lord, help me. Lord, your servant, your faithful servant, help me. Oh Lord, I am in pain, help me. We're told 3 times, 3 occasions, he did this, and the Lord's response was, my grace is sufficient for you. In the original language, the wording is somewhat switched, where it says, the grace of me is sufficient for you. The grace of me, my abiding presence with you, your awareness of my presence with you, the result of what you have faced in this trial you've endured, the result of that is that you are closer to me than you have ever been. The grace of me is sufficient for you. In each of these 3 reasons why people get sick, I still want to point out, Jesus is able to heal each one. It's His choosing. It's His timing. God is concerned about our physical condition as well as our spiritual condition. If this were not the case, He would not have promised to provide for our earthly needs. And let us remember, we have been created in His image, so the whole person is important to God. 1 Peter 2:24 says, He Himself bore our sins in His body on the cross, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. For by His wounds you were healed. The atoning work of Jesus Christ on the cross was not only for our spiritual benefit, but also includes the physical as well. Matthew 8, verse 16, when evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to Him, and He drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities and bore our diseases. And of course, that is a reference to Isaiah chapter 53. Surely He took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered Him punished by God, stricken by Him, and afflicted. But He was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him. And by his wounds, we are healed. We can clearly see that Jesus, being God, fulfilled the prophecies concerning his ability to heal. And I do not believe for a moment that healing ceased when Jesus returned to the Father. He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. I know there are some, I have talked to some Christians over the years who believe that. They believe miracles don't happen anymore. I don't understand that. My God has not changed. His arm is not too short. He does not lack power to do the miraculous. And he is still the one who is aware of your suffering. He is still the one who forgives your sin. He is still the one who heals all manner of diseases today. Jesus is able to replace sin and sickness with forgiveness and healing. He came to restore us to God, to reconcile us in our relationship, to remove the curse of sin from our lives. Now, I will not stand here and claim that God will heal everyone who is sick today. I do not know what his will is for you. But I will say this. If you don't believe God can heal you, or if you don't ask him to, then you won't be healed. He still asks the question of us, do you want to be made well? Do you want me to change your life? Is anyone among you suffering? Let him pray. Is anyone among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer offered in faith will restore the one who is sick, and the Lord will raise him up. And if he has committed sins, they will be forgiven. This morning, we're going to simply respond in obedience to his word.